broad category of effects, or what I like to call time-based. And I say time-based, not in that you look at them in a time domain like the distortion or other things, but they are based on time delay. You know, really delay-based is probably a better name for it. The first one, look at really delay and echo. I want to talk about digital echo at this point, kind of is the easiest to understand, but it's one of the newer variations. In reality, since effects were, started in the 60s, they didn't have digital delay type of systems. You just couldn't do that. You had computers that filled rooms. You weren't going to, sample a guitar. So previous to digital, you had analog, and you had what I call discrete time. I'll talk a little bit about that and the way terms are used that, don't completely agree with, but, just to let you know what other people mean by certain terms. Reverberation is a variation on that. We'll talk about reverb. Chorus and flanging, and then, actually, I'm not sure if I actually get the pitch shifting or octave. The octave we talked about a little beforehand. Digital pitch shifting, again, is something I'm still grasping to understand. Actually, as what I mentioned earlier, there is a book that I highly recommend. They have a copy at NYU called DAFX. Digital Audio Effects is basically what it is, DAFX. And they, not only do they go through a lot of different effect processing, they do it at more of an EE level, which is rare. About the few that I know of, one of the few things I know of. And then the nice thing too is all their examples are in MATLAB, and you can actually download all the MATLAB from the website. So the book itself, unfortunately, is quite expensive, but like I said, NYU does have a copy of it, so I'd recommend checking it out if you're into this. Yeah, basically, I've been reading chapter 7 on time segment processing, which describes some of the methods of doing pitch shifting, and then chapter 8 gets into the phase vocoder, which is the more advanced methods of doing frequency shift or pitch shifting. Again, I'm not sure which is used in a lot of devices because companies don't like to reveal what they use. But I recommend that if you want to look more into pitch shifting and any of this effect stuff. It goes from the basics to advanced. All right, so first I want to talk a little bit about analog versus digital, right? It helps to remember, where does the term analog come from? I mean, it's something you got to take for granted. You don't think about. What does analog mean?
Continuous?
Well, that's what we think of it as, right? Continuous voltage, continuous time. If you look at it, the root, analog, is, what's an analog? It's a comparison. You relate something to another. Something's analogous to something else. So the idea actually is that an analog signal, for instance, the analog signal of the guitar string, is analogous to the vibration of the guitar string. The analog signal from a microphone is analogous to the pressure waves from a speech signal. So that's really what analog comes from, right? It's an analog of a physical thing. Now, this should actually be analog delay. Now, I want to talk about what people say when they mean analog delays. There are a couple of limited examples of truly analog delays. One of which is the tape echo, which I'll talk about that. It basically records to a tape and reads from a tape. There's another one that a friend reminded me of that is called the Morley oil can delay. I think I showed you, I had some schematics for it. That recorded the sound electrostatically. So same basic principles, electromagnetic, electrostatic. But a lot of people talk about analog delay pedals. They're not talking about these things with the moving parts that are recording the playback devices. They're talking about things that are bucket brigade shaped. And you know what a bucket brigade is? The bucket brigade is a very old technique of fighting a fire, where you line a bunch of people up from the fire to the well, You dip the bucket in the well and you pass the bucket down. Well, similarly, in electronic devices, this is called the charge coupled device. And what it basically is, effectively, is a block of capacitors and transmission gears. So that you sample the signal to get its voltage. You put that voltage on the first capacitor. Now you sample the signal again, the sampling period later. You move the first capacitor voltage to the second capacitor and the new sample voltage to the first capacitor. So in that way, the samples are passed down the bucket per gauge capacitor. And that works pretty well, excuse me. You can pass it down. The issue is if you try to sample too long, or basically if you ask the capacitor to hold that charge too long, you'll degrade the signal. It starts to decrease. Or if you pass it off too many times, it'll degrade the signal. And so what happens in that is that typically the practical limit on most bucket per gauge devices is 300 milliseconds. After 300 milliseconds, it's kind of degraded a lot. But even within the 300 milliseconds, you get a little bit of degradation. However, most people appreciate that. It's got kind of this warm sound. A digital delay is a perfect delay. It's a perfect copy, right? As far as you read it, you put it in memory, then you read it out of memory until you get to A. And, whatever A to B, B to A issues you have. But otherwise, you can keep playing that same delay forever. Until the power runs out. So when people say analog, they typically mean bucket per gauge. But I like to differentiate. In some sense, a bucket per gauge is kind of discrete time, right? Because you've got a sampling, and you've got all the rules that apply to sampling the signal. But it's not purely discrete time, of course, because the values degrade. So it's corrupted discrete time, if you will. But like I said, sampling theory still applies. So that's why I don't like considering it analog. Okay. So let's look at the basic delay. And I'm going to show digital delay again because it's easy to understand. You guys know what digital delay is. It's z to the minus n, right? It's just a delay block. So the output is a copy of the input signal. You specify the delay block. You have a delay mix, which determines how loud your delay value is, and then you have the input, and they're added back together. One of the things you can do is adjust the delay to match tempo, and you can actually get it so it sounds like, if you do it just right, it builds with the song, and you can get it so that possibly if you're playing quarter notes, it sounds like eighth notes and that kind of thing. That's helped by more modern delays where you actually have tap tempo, where you can actually tap the pedal to give it the tempo. So no longer do you have to sit there and twiddle the knob to get it to match the tempo. You can change it on the fly by tapping the information into it. We'll show, typically delays also have feedback. I'll show that on the next slide as echo. Then there are also categories of delays, and then they have certain names. Like for instance, if you talk about a particularly short delay, like 40 to 120 milliseconds, that's called slapback. And it's just a particular type of sound. Okay. And then the delay time, the total delay time is often varied by changing the sampling rate, which seems a little odd at first. You would think, in digital, you think, oh, well, the delay time is determined by the sampling rate times the number of samples. I'll just reduce the number of samples and get a shorter bucket. And that is how it's done in certain cases. But in cases where it's a dedicated piece of hardware doing the delay, very often it's easy just to change the sampling rate. And this has the advantage of when you change the sampling rate, you get kinds of cool pitch shifty effects. Because you've got a certain sample in memory, and then you change the rate you're playing it at, and it'll come out different effects. And I'll demonstrate that with the analog delay I brought in. Some example sound. And I Ran by Flock of Seagulls is a great example of this rhythmic delay. They did VH1 had a series called, what was it, Band Reunited or something. And they go around, they find the members of an old band, and they get them back together, and they get them to play something. And so they got Flock of Seagulls back together. And it was hilarious because they all got together, and the guitarist hadn't played guitar in a number of years, and so he still had the same equipment.